trad wives. Everyone's talking about trad wives on Instagram at this point in time. And I was really curious about it. I was really curious about contemporary dating in general as someone that grew up with social media and early dating apps and didn't really use them myself until my 20s. But yeah, I'm generally pretty optimistic about the future. And I think by the end, you'll understand why. But follow me down this exploration of American dating through the lens of the pursuit of American equality, the rise of mass media, and my own little cerebral intellectual claims. Welcome to Hot Literati. Hot Literati is a collective of hot, cool, well-read people. I am Halo, and I'm so happy that you're here. So before we get into it, I want to explain kind of my personal philosophy that's informed a lot of my intellectual work, my personal choices, as well as my business. I'm really passionate about media, and media is information. You know, media is just like what you see and what you're taking into your mind. And so I think we are in the age of information, right? Like we have the internet, we have access to so much information all the time, but we also have the present world. And this really brilliant artist once said to me, the internet is also a place that you go. And I totally agree. I think it can be a great place if navigated with intention. And I think presence in the real world is just as important. So just to kind of give us a timeline of like the media world versus reality, in specifically looking at America. In the 1690s, we get the first newspaper. It's in Boston. It's like small, really irregular, limited batches. But this is the first time that people have this form of like escapism beyond oral storytelling, right? Like you are able to have a newspaper, carry it around with you, and you're reading it and you're not like present in the room with the other people unless you're like daydreaming, you know? So then by 1740s, 50s, the newspapers are like more regular things and they have like marriage announcements, social life. And then by the 1800s, we have systemic publishing of newspapers, social columns. By the late 1800s, we have like yellow journalism. So then there's like scandal, romance, human interest stories, because people figured out like, oh, people like this and we can make money. So that is kind of my philosophy with media. Like media is so subjective because it's, there's something I call narrative subjectivity. You know, the narrative that we kind of have and hold is the one that's still there. It's the one that's lasted throughout history, or the one that has been like read enough times by everyone to be like, oh yeah, this is what happened. And I think America, obviously having like a really fraught country, but also having this like interwoven through line of independence and like thinking for yourself. I think America is a really interesting country where like narrative subjectivity is really up for, it's like always being debated, right? We're always like resurfacing something about our own history and like trying to reckon with it. So that's kind of the philosophy I'm bringing to this. Like I think in terms of media, being aware of your media diet, what you're consuming, is always going to be really important. And myself as like a distributor of media, it's something I'm really passionate about, is trying to make sure that the media, there's a Prince quote I love actually. He says this about art, but I think it's true for art and media, that it either encourages or discourages. And my goal is always to have you leaving a video, a podcast episode, a book, having had an honest experience with it, but also feeling like the world is a generally good place and you can have a positive impact on it. It's a philosophy I'm carving out myself and my relationship with it in a book I'm working on called The American Princess Diet, exploring my relationship with media, my journey recovering from an eating disorder, and so much more. But now let's get into the meat of the video, which is on dating. Okay, now looking at early American history. So it's the 1600s, and the standard for marriage or like coupling is courtship, right? Which means that a man would approach a woman's father at this point in time and say like, I want to marry your daughter. And the things on the table are not romantic love all. The things on the table generally are like land, money, like social positioning, like familial stuff like that. And then we have the complex relationship of America's history to this, right? Because obviously America, we have the history of chattel slavery. So then we have the Black American experience and the white American experience, which is the lens that I'm looking at this through. But there's also, you could have the queer American experience. You could have the like Native American experience or Indigenous American experience. And the problem with narrative advantage, or of looking back in general, is that we're always subject to the narratives that have been preserved. By labeling anyone, we run the risk of putting people into boxes and losing like individual narratives, which is why art and honestly just like personal narrative too is so important, because that's what really incites empathy. But for the sake of getting like a top-down history, we are going to be using like broader categories for this. So we have the Black American experience and the white American experience, right? And the white American experience is the one that I just said, like courtship to marriage, to have like a family unit, but you still have like relationships of generational family, extended family, living together, working together. A lot of the time home and work is kind of like combined in the sense of maybe you're like the butcher and your butcher shop is like run by your entire family and that's what you do. But then the Black American experience obviously is like so much more fraught, because right now we're in the throes of like chattel slavery. And Albert Rabbitoe, one of my favorite writers in terms of the American history and the experience of the enslaved, wrote this beautiful account of interviews called Slave Religion that talks about like Black Americans and their experience trying to go to like church, because church is like this third space at this point in time, And so Black Americans are trying to get married among themselves. They're like asking permission to have ceremonies, stuff like that, or they're just having their own. But with chattel slavery, their family units are being torn apart. They're essentially being treated like property and like almost like livestock, which is, looking back, it's so painful and it's like such a cruel human experience to have endured. But I think it also shows like the resilience of Black Americans in the Black community. So you have these two experiences, right? But then nothing is ever black and white. And biracial, multiracial relationships still happen. A lot of them are assault and are like not consensual, which again shows like the pain of American history. And when it's like a man assaulting a woman, at this point in culture, like no one's punished, which I think William Faulkner writes about the confusion in this whole era really well. And then Toni Morrison, who was also a fan of Faulkner's work, but obviously like her relationship to the work is like much more personal and close and provides the perspective of like a Black woman. She writes about the confusion of this era and the inherent pain in a way that I think exhumed it for so much of the American consciousness. And in 1691, because whenever like a white woman would have a relationship with a Black man at this point in time, she would get ostracized from the community. So you have something at this point in time called miscegenation, which is like this heady academic word for like multiracial relationships. And in 1691, Virginia passed an anti-miscegenation law, meaning that people couldn't have multiracial relationships, and mixed race children were enslaved. And it was like said that they would go with the race of the mother, but we perpetuated the one drop rule, and there are just so many like painful narratives from this point in time, right? Okay, so 1865, slavery is abolished, but now knowing like Juneteenth and just more like context and like personal narratives, obviously we know like nothing is ever that clean, that like black and white. But we do enter what we've labeled the Reconstruction Period until about 1877. So this is this point in American history where like slavery has been abolished and people don't really, like a new precedent hasn't entirely been set. So formerly enslaved people at this point in time, they get to like legalize their marriages, and marriage becomes this like social structure of freedom, of dignity, of quote unquote civilization, and churches, which I really recommend reading Albert Rabbitoe's work if you want to go deeper into like this whole rabbit hole. But churches are like central to community life at this point in American history, right? And they become like third spaces. So you still see a separation though between white American church and Black American church, like viscerally. By 1827, we have Black newspapers because Black media and white media in America exist like entirely separately, and they are publishing, the same things like social announcements, but they're really perpetuating at this point in time, or kind of like laying the groundwork for respectability politics, which is one of the things I specialized in at Princeton. So respectability politics are kind of create this pressure to conform to what is quote unquote respectable or civilized, which because of American history, a lot of the time is this precedent that was set by like white Americans and like white institutions, and then Black Americans would almost like emulate these things to try to avoid like violence. It's really apparent in documents from like the National Association of Colored Women and like speeches that would be given. This ties into, like marriage, hair, politics, the way one would dress, so much. And it creates this pressure to conform to what is quote unquote respectable that we still see so much discourse on in so many different ways today. Okay, so now I want to move into a discussion around race, war, private public life, and the family unit and what it sort of looks like at this point in time, right? So in the 1870s, we get to Jim Crow America, which Jim Crow is this new era of American discrimination where Black Americans would face a lot of violence in like public spaces. And I want to make a distinction here between like private and public life, right? So private life is like the life inside of the home, the private life of like the family unit, which when you look at American history, like churches, I think, are this interesting space where they become like public life as they're kind of built out, because they become these third spaces like churches, restaurants, community centers, and then private life is like inside of the home, right? And during slavery, like Black Americans didn't really have their own private life. Their private life, they like tried to, but it could be violated at any point in time. And then so Reconstruction becomes this point in time where like Black Americans get to build out their own like private life to an extent, and their own public life. So they're like making their own churches, they're making their own businesses, like stuff like that. But then with Jim Crow America, you get this point where these like public facilities, there starts to be like a new precedent set around segregation. And obviously there's still just like violence happening. And I think it's related, but then you also get industrialization, right? Because industrialization is like the creation of industry, right? And that's when we start to see these really interesting like white American male millionaires be born, like John D. Rockefeller is a case in point example. He founded Standard Oil in 1870, and he is like one of the first American men to become like really, really wealthy, right? And in this relationship of like American public life versus private life, obviously there's still an adherence to traditional gender roles where it's like, oh, the man is like earning, the woman is basically like navigating and monitoring the private life, like the home life. And with Black Americans, which was some of like my independent research at Princeton, like Black American families are like very different because labor in general was more accessible to women because they had experiences of working like doing like hard labor, but then they also had jobs in the private life and like the homes of white Americans. So labor for the Black community is actually like more accessible for women. And then you have almost like domestic violence, like different accounts around like infidelity, which I think you can see this in the work of like Alice Walker, The Color Purple, like because they're not adhering to what white America kind of models as like the quote unquote perfect family. You have this thread, this through line of like shame, and it emerges in like domestic violence, infidelity, stuff like that. Zora Neale Hurston also has like really great writing around this if you want to dig deeper. So this is like the birth of the like millionaire man, right? And he becomes like really kind of like worshipped in American press until he's vilified. But then we get, like Jim Crow. So in 1890, Mississippi sets this precedent with like literacy tests that disenfranchises Black voters. In 1896, we get Plessy versus Ferguson, which creates like separate but equal America, so segregation. And throughout all of this, industrialization starts to really take root in the US and really breaks up the family unit, because for the first time, people are going to work in factories that people like Rockefeller, like Carnegie, like these people create, J.G. Heinz. So the American family unit at this point in time becomes much smaller because they aren't working like generationally on one family company anymore. Okay, 1914, World War I, and war becomes this neutralizing force where both Black and white Americans are sent to fight together, even though, racial tensions exist within that context too. However, something really interesting happens after the war where we get the post-war reaction, which during times of like global conflict in general, or times that make you confront your own mortality, there is this human pattern. Like I remember reading this book about Michel de Montaigne, the French writer, and how this same pattern would happen for people after plagues, where people become either like really conservative or really progressive, right? So it's like the philosophy of like fear of death, fear of change, and really wanting to hold on to like rules versus fear of death, fear of change, and wanting to kind of milk life for all it's worth and like experience the most of it and party and things like that. So that kind of explains like the flapper era and like the Red Scare. And you can look at it through two different lenses, right? Like you have white Americans, the Red Scare, groups like the KKK. You also have the flapper era, which we have forever cemented through work like The Great Gatsby that really show kind of some of the tensions. It's like great American novel for a reason, right? But then I would also argue work like Jessie Redmond Fawcett's Plum Bun, which she's a writer that I studied a lot in college. She actually discovered Langston Hughes. She's like not song enough, She really explores the Black American experience during this time as we get into the Harlem Renaissance, where she writes about respectability politics in a really interesting way, where you do have that in the Black community, but at the same time, after Black soldiers like served in World War I that came back to Jim Crow era laws, you have this determination to like create their own culture, which is when we get the Harlem Renaissance and just this like beautiful era of Black art. But then nothing is ever completely separate, And I read this book on Josephine Baker this year, and Josephine Baker emerges as the most interesting figure in the context of all of this, because some of her earliest memories are during a race riot, like trying to escape the town that she was born in, and then she's so determined to make it as a performer that she is. Everyone loves her, but then she gets accused of being a communist, and she actually has to like go to France to perform to have the life that she wants. but she deals with like so much trauma, like racial trauma, financial trauma, and she's never really able to get her legs like back under her. Granted, the biography I read, I think, was extremely biased and not well researched. So this is like one man's perspective, but he says that there are accounts of her on stage like telling her audience that she didn't know how to make money, she didn't really know how to have agency, which I think is discourse we're still seeing today with musicians and artists. But I think that's a video essay for another time. I think the biggest takeaway from this like post-war era, right, is that the emergence of personal identity and individual choice, and this idea that when people feel powerless, they want to assert identity, assert agency through personal choices. And a lot of the time those personal choices can still happen within the context of groupthink, you know, with something like the Red Scare, or even identifying with, you know, like being a flapper and personal choice in like that sense. So within the context of personal choice, this is when we get the beginning of modern dating culture, which we have now. And another really interesting thing that happens at this point in the 20s is early car culture. People start to get cars. This becomes a part of their day-to-day life. And there are these like really American ideologies that are emerging around individual choice, individual fulfillment, and the desire for like personal and cultural expression. But then in the 1930s, we get the Great Depression. And again, it's this sort of neutralizing force where people pull back a bit from asserting like individual freedom because of economic hardship. And dating becomes quote unquote cheaper. People start to go to more house parties instead of like the jazz clubs of the 1920s. They start to go to more like church socials. They prioritize like walks, picnics, listening to the radio together, which noting that radio exists is really important in the context of just like media in general. And there does begin to be more just like practical courtship, kind of a swing back towards like that way of dating, even though the more like free individual way of dating exists, it's just like more low key. And people begin to get like married a little bit later. They begin to make more like family unit centered decisions. And something really interesting that happens around the 30s as well is the groundwork for suburban America begins to be laid through like New Deal programs and stuff like that. So a big takeaway here is that dating adapted to economic necessity as the Great Depression began. Fast forward to 1941, the United States enters World War II, and we enter this era of economic boom. And war brought more people to cities, so you get more like cultural exchange within the US, and also more like, yeah, people just meeting people with different backgrounds, different contexts, and you get more like employment. People begin to work, like women begin to work, people have more money, and people begin to spend more money on dating again. And women entering the workforce at this point in time, both Black and white women, was really like groundbreaking for, again, this notion of like public versus private life. Women have like workplaces that they leave their home, they go to, and then they come back. And this, in the face of this war, American identity begins to be like strengthened because there's this really heroic notion of defeating fascism abroad, right? And you get, an uptick in the economy. Women are experiencing independence, which is also manifesting in like dating life. And there is an increase in interracial relationships because, again, like people are just hanging out with people that are very different from them because they're moving around the country in a really different way. Okay, so then in 1945, World War II ends. And this really interesting thing happens in America right after, where in 1947, Levittown opens. And Levittown is like the prototype for mass suburbia. This idea of you can have like one place and all the homes will look the same and they'll all like drive into this one area, work, come back. And Black families were also excluded from suburbia with things like redlining. And we get this phenomenon at this point in time called white flight, which is when like a lot of white families moved into suburbs, creating quote unquote urban areas or cities that were like predominantly Black, and these like suburban neighborhoods that were predominantly white. Now, looking back at media, remember when I said like media is really important, because media becomes both this thing that people are consuming, it's like entertainment, but it's also control, like Jim Morrison from The Doors talked about this a lot, how media is like lending your mind to someone, it's like watching something and just making your perspective like subject to that for a little bit, especially when it's media that's constructed, like a narrative, a book, a film, a YouTube video. And that's why I'm crazy about my media diet, and I would encourage you to do so as well, because in the 1950s, women are used to working, the world looks really different, suburban America is starting, and it's like this really strange recipe where people, like, private life begins to be really strong, and people have this like loss of identity because the ways in which Americans move throughout American life begins to be like really constructed, and we get the emergence of the nuclear family as like the quote unquote perfect American family. But the reality of it is the nuclear family was never really accessible for everyone. It was a really specific like white middle class family that you think of like Leave It to Beaver, these shows, and it's posited as aspirational, which is why it's like nostalgic for so many people, because the branding was really good. The branding of the nuclear family was really good, really strong. And this fantasy would be used to justify like racial discrimination, because back to respectability politics, like Black families were told like this is aspirational for you and like you can't have it. But the same thing would happen to like white working class families, where they were told like this is aspirational and you haven't achieved it, so it's like a moral failure, which I think this idea of moral failing is something that's really deeply ingrained in American culture with our background with Puritanism as well. Okay, so now looking towards the 1960s, we get the Civil Rights Movement, we get Loving versus Virginia, and then we get the Stonewall riots, right? So the Civil Rights Movement, one of the earliest sit-ins actually was in my hometown, Wichita, Kansas, one of the first successful sit-ins. And then the youth movement is this point in the 60s where with media, like TV, radio, magazines, instead of people having these like hyper-local identities kind of shaped by their parents, like local gossip, church, there begins to be this collective youth identity in the US, and young people are beginning to challenge the beliefs of their elders. They're beginning to say like, actually, like we don't want to be racist and homophobic, and we want to believe this instead of that. And I really want to emphasize that the youth movement is, I would argue, this response to exposure, to like personal narrative, to people who are cool, to people, to like art, and this encouragement to really like reflect on personal values and like what they think, and then so Loving versus Virginia is the story of this interracial couple who was arrested and then told they had to leave Virginia for 25 years, and it becomes this really powerful moment where interracial marriage is legalized. And then right after, we get Stonewall, this like really gorgeous moment for queer rights where people are literally like fighting police for the right to gather in social spaces where they can meet and form relationships. So, and then, I know this is going to sound out of left field, but with the through line of media, I think it is really important. In 1968, in Star Trek, the first interracial on-screen kiss happens between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. And because it is shown on screen by a major network, it begins to be seen as normal and acceptable and normative, which is so important. And it's like such a win for interracial relationships in the US. I want to stop here to present an idea that's like my independent intellectual work, even though I'm sure someone else has said something similar at some point, because nothing new under the sun. I would call it the personal societal media loop, right? You're always either generating a thought or consuming one. You are looking at something or you're imagining something. And I think social change and media representation happens in this loop, right? Like creative people either produce something that reflects the experience that they are having, or they produce something that they would like to see. And Star Trek is this really gorgeous point where they take something painful happening in America at that point in time and they imagine like a more beautiful version of it. Whereas I think with the industrialization of media in general, and I'll get to that a little bit more, we're at this interesting point in time where most of the stuff we're consuming is just a byproduct of what's happening, instead of imagining like more beautiful things that could happen and cementing like those ideas in the American consciousness, instead of kind of just spiraling culture into itself. And the big takeaway from this idea that I want you to leave with, and I'll reiterate at the end, is go make beautiful art. Like, think of a world you would want to live in and create that world, because people need stories like that, especially like young people and children. Okay, so then in the 80s, we enter the Reagan era, and something really interesting happens to media, because this is when Fox News starts. And I know you all have seen Succession. You know, I don't have to give you like the whole rundown. Political divisiveness, fear-based media, the 24-hour news cycle, and all of a sudden, stranger danger begins to be a concept that really takes root in the American consciousness. And in 1985, we do get the first representation of like a queer relationship through an NBC TV movie, An Early Frost. However, it has this like tragic ending, and instead of imagining like a really beautiful future, even though it's important for the sake of representation, it begins to lay this groundwork in the American consciousness of, again, like fear. So while Star Trek showed an interracial kiss in 1968 because of Loving versus Virginia, Stonewall, for example, we had to wait like 22 years to see a queer relationship represented on network television after that. And I want to circle back around to the youth movement and exposure and personal narrative, because exposure to someone, exposure to their human experience is what really incites empathy in people, which is why it is important to show like personal narrative to make sure that these stories get like captured and shown in ways that are beautiful and real and honest and raw, which I would argue is always the purpose of art. So just to zoom in on dating again, because I told you guys I'm very tangential. Before the sexual revolution, dating was like courtship, marriage, but again, complexities within like race, sexuality, so on and so forth. And sex was this thing that in the American consciousness was supposed to happen after marriage. Women's virginity was a commodity. Relationships were more about like economic social partnerships. After the sexual revolution, dating is like recreational and exploratory, but again, we still kind of have respectability politics and things existing within this. Sex becomes more casual. It becomes a part of getting to know someone. Women are finally able to pursue like sexual pleasure, and relationships become more about personal fulfillment and compatibility. But by the time we get to the 80s with the Reagan era, you get more status symboling within dating, like designer clothes, expensive restaurants, career success begins to matter like more than ever. Expensive dates begin to be normative, which they like really hadn't before. And then going back to fear-based media, you get really sensationalized coverage around AIDS, which in terms of like revolutions around like acceptance of sexuality, obviously that sets us back because there's this like mass hysteria within fear-based media around that. You could argue that this is when dating becomes like really transactional, when class barriers within dating begin to be hardened, and when these questions around authenticity and performance begin to take root as opposed to just pursuing a genuine connection with someone. Okay, and then fast forward to the 90s, right? We get the internet, we get Steve Jobs, and this is why I brought up Rockefeller, because Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, these men in tech who have like a crazy success, I think are almost worshipped in the American consciousness as this new like performance of ideal masculinity within the industrialization age. And internet dating is crazy because it breaks down these geographic barriers, right? Like if you ventured into the unknown and you met someone there, and infidelity, for example, like if you cheated on someone when you were traveling, the first way that that would have come out within American history is like when DNA technology and paternity tests were like made widely accessible, right? But internet dating is this new thing where we almost have these trails of our connections to one another with messages, with like pictures, with media that we can create and hold and have ourselves. So with the internet, you have more choice of information, and dating becomes like more and more about individual choice and more globalized because you can meet someone and choose to remain in contact with them through messages, through calls for the first time in human history, as opposed to just having to like write a letter and trust that it would get there. And I just want to pause and say like two other concepts that have really affected me. I don't remember where I read this one or where I heard it, but it's really stuck in my mind, this notion of culture as a pendulum, right? And this law of unintended consequences. Like whenever something happens in the world, whenever we make something, we have like a goal, right? And inevitably there are always these unintended consequences. And I think with tech or the creation of tech, a lot of the things people are trying to make are kind of the culture going back the other way, or trying to fix some of the problems that were made with an early iteration of tech, which I think makes it a lot friendlier to think of it like that. Like we're just always trying to solve problems instead of trying to dominate or create more. So the app revolution of the 2010s with Facebook, which again, Mark Zuckerberg, like a contemporary Rockefeller, you know, where he has this amassed like this big amount of wealth. But then I think the rise of mass media has also done this really interesting thing where someone like Rockefeller and someone like Zuckerberg are like very different. And I want to do a different video essay on fame and through the lens of Max Weber. And because I think it's like there's so many different angles you can take, because there are early interviews of Zuckerberg saying his goal was to like connect the entire world with internet, right? And essentially he does that, which I think you could argue is a reaction to the 1980s stranger danger that takes people like out of their communities and makes them like really afraid of one another. Okay, so in the dating app age, human biases that have always existed begin to sort of take root, because Douglas Hofstadter, one of my favorite computer philosophers, says that what we make is always like a mirror. You know, anything that we create is sort of a reflection of us, our experiences, how we view the world, and our intention with making it. So dating apps perpetuate these like human things that have always happened within American history, like class segregation, wealth and status signaling, geographic segregation. But social media exists as this separate thing where people are beginning to create like groups based on solidarity. And again, like what media does to your mind in terms of critical thinking, in terms of your ability to think for yourself, I think is really important here to talk about, because if you're shown like the philosophies for one group over and over and over, you are going to begin to develop like a solidarity for that group. And that's something called algorithmic radicalization. It's like a new phenomenon that's kind of emerged. So social media, like, you can like fall in love with people. You can fall in love with an influencer that you just like see on your phone enough and begin to project onto. Whereas dating apps, you go like with the intention of dating someone, but then they do perpetuate just, like decision paralysis. They're a very different experience for men and women. Like Jonathan Haidt writes about this with social media too, where young girls are like shown Instagram with the intention of like what I eat in a day is beauty content, basically turning themselves into a product. Whereas like young men are shown, like boys and men are shown social media with the intention of getting them to spend money, whether it's like gambling, explicit content, stuff like that. So, we've had discourse around the attention economy, so I don't want to spend like too much time on that, but it's not the best experience for anyone, even though the intention at first was like probably really earnest and reaction to people becoming like more disconnected after the 80s. Fast forward to 2020, we have COVID, and which obviously sends us all inside, but also inside on our phones. So we're like looking at each other from screens. And this is where I would argue private and public life begin to really become blended in the most interesting way that hasn't really been reversed since the beginning of industrialization, where you're working from home for the first time for many people in the US ever. And work from home, like home used to be work in a very different setting where you would have these like generational families living together, working together, except now we're like working for these big corporations that are kind of like the extension of something like a Rockefeller or a Carnegie would have made. But then with the internet, they get like more online, and we get the emergence of like the desk job and the cubicle. But we're also like home at the same time, and it begins to be really confusing. And social media does this interesting thing that, what's that one show talks about? I know you guys know what I'm talking about, where there's like your public identity and your private identity, like who you are when you're home, who you are when you're at work, and then maybe who you are at like a third space. But all of these different identities begin to be merged into the same person, or two different identities, which is your like IRL identity and your online identity. However, most people are consuming content so much online that it's sort of like flattened their IRL identity. And I think people are generally like less expressive because they're not really sitting in like silence and thinking about who they want to be. And that time for reflection is really important in the context of dating, like dating, intentional dating, whatever you want to call it, because who do you want to be goes hand in hand with what kind of life do you want. Like, do you want to be married? What kind of a partner do you want to have? And one thing I'm obsessed with that I think we could also say is that we are in this really interesting era of sensory deprivation, where sure, we're not going to the mall anymore. We're like sitting on our phones, but we're not having the experience of walking by the person at the counter, give you a perfume sample. We're looking at something that's like flat. And Jonathan Haidt cites this really interesting thing in The Anxious Generation about how synchronous movement, like being in front of someone, mirroring them, seeing their eyes, increases trust. It increases community trust. It makes you realize like, oh, this person isn't a threat to me. They're actually just like human like me. So it is really important to be in a third space, to be like at a community center, to go on a date instead of just like messaging someone, because it does increase trust, increase empathy, and your sense of just belonging in the world. So what in the world does this all say about dating now? Well, I step back to tell you, I don't know. I'm 24. I'm like trying to figure it out just like you all. But I think when there's so much discourse around trad wives, around the internet, around separation between genders and heteronormative dating contexts, I think it's really important to look back at our history to realize like it's nobody's, it's just these patterns have emerged from other things that have happened, and it's like pretty normal. And I think it's important to look forward and just ask like, how do we make this better? Given universal truths. And I think setting these like personal universal truths are really important, and having people to look up to is really important in light of that. mine are, I love Fyodor Dostoevsky because he was one of the first in the Brothers Karamazov writers I ever read, write about how everyone thinks that they're doing the best that they can given the context and values in which they were raised in. And I think that's why empathy is so important. And it's just basic human psychology. You can't take something away from someone and tell them you can't have that, because it incites shame and it makes everyone feel bad. We have to think more about what positive thing can we add that will make this better. And I also think I am religious. I love the teachings of Jesus Christ because I think it is really beautiful sentiment, just love people no matter what. And that's why I love Dostoevsky too, because he has this really gorgeous interpretation of it that is the power of humble love. He has a quote that's humble love has the power to save the world. So, whether you're a dude watching this that's fed up with dating apps and feeling like you can't get any matches, or if you're a woman watching this who has just had a really hard time feeling humanized in the contemporary dating context, or if you're just curious and nerdy and wanting to overthink American culture and things going on in the world, I think these universal truths always point towards empathy, and that humankind has always made systems. We've always made systems out of survival, out of just setting and context. But I think fear-based media in general has pointed us to the point where we're at now in the age of information. And that's why I'm so passionate about creating media that puts things into contexts, asks questions, and makes you feel just generally more optimistic. Because if you look back, we as a human race have survived a lot of stuff. We've always figured it out. And there have been just beautiful personal narratives of people falling in love, of people doing incredible things in spite of that. Electricity, traffic lights, planes, sliced bread. And I think to have faith, to dream, to even dream about love and fall in love with everyone, in not even a romantic sense, but a platonic sense, to have respect for everyone, is so important. So what is true is that most people are generally kind. You just have to talk to them and listen and care. That love exists in every era, under all circumstances, and that the person next to you in the office, in the coffee shop, is probably not dangerous and would actually probably appreciate connection, a conversation, a hello, just as much as you. And real intimacy is built through shared experiences, not clicks, not profiles. So I would just encourage you to go out into the world with love, to travel, to expand your worldview, and to always try to be kind. And I promise, that is how you pursue a good and meaningful life, and probably fall in love. Thank you so much for watching this, for overthinking with me. And I'll talk to you guys when I have my next obsession.